My name is Abigail Novak, and I was 28 years old when my younger brother decided that my success was something he had a right to destroy. I had spent 4 years building toward one specific moment. 4 years of nights that ended at 2 in the morning, of skipping birthday parties and holiday dinners and weekend trips I couldn't afford anyway, of saying, not yet, maybe next year, to everything that wasn't directly connected to the goal in front of me. I was a pastry chef by training and a cake designer by obsession, and I had applied for a residency at the Harlow Institute in Chicago, a 12-week intensive program run by one of the most respected names in competitive confectionery in the country. Only 8 candidates were accepted each cycle. The application required a physical portfolio, photographs of your work, a written philosophy statement, and 3 original sugar sculptures delivered in person on the day of your final evaluation. I had been working on those sculptures for 6 weeks. The largest one was a 5-tiered architectural piece built around the concept of erosion. Each tier slightly more weathered than the one above it, with hand-pulled sugar filaments representing water running through cracked stone. It stood 14 inches tall and had taken me 11 attempts to get the sugar pulling temperature. Right, so the filaments would hold their shape without collapsing. I had transported it twice in practice runs just to know how it would behave in a car. I had a custom foam-lined case I'd built myself from materials I ordered online and cut to fit. The second piece was smaller, more delicate. A lattice sugar cage enclosing a single isomalt flower with hand-painted petals. The cage was the part that mattered. I had pulled and assembled each bar individually, and the spacing was precise to a 1/4 inch all the way around. That one had taken me 3 weeks, just to stop breaking it at the joining points. The third piece was the simplest visually but the hardest technically, a clear pulled sugar orb the size of a grapefruit, hollow, with a smaller solid sphere suspended inside it without any visible support. The internal sphere was tinted a deep amber. From a distance it looked like inside a glass planet. I had gotten that effect by cooling the orb at a specific angle on a silicone mat and using a method I'd figured out myself after failing 14 times. My evaluation at the Harlow Institute was scheduled for a Thursday at 10 in the morning. I had taken the whole week off from the bakery where I worked, partly to finish the sculptures and partly to rest, because I knew I'd be useless if I went in exhausted. I packed the case on Tuesday evening after doing a final check on all 3 pieces. Everything was stable. Everything was right. I set the case by the front door of the house I was renting and went to bed at 9 o'clock feeling, for the first time in months, like I was ready. My younger brother Caden was 24. He had moved in with me 8 months earlier after losing his apartment, and I had said yes because he was my brother, and because our mother asked me to, and because I genuinely believed it would be temporary. He didn't have a job when he moved in. He got one, eventually, 3 days a week at a sporting goods store, but he spent most of his time in the common areas of my house, watching things on his phone, eating food I bought, and making comments about my work that were designed to sound like observations but always landed like criticisms. When I got my Harlow application shortlisted 6 months after he moved in, he said, "That's cool. What happens if you don't get it?" When I built the first full draft of the erosion piece, he walked into the kitchen, looked at it for a long moment, and said, "It kind of looks like a melting wedding cake." When I told him the residency came with a $6.00 stipend and a guaranteed placement with one of the Institute's partner studios afterward, he went quiet in the way he went quiet when information didn't fit the story he was telling himself. I thought I understood the dynamic. I thought I had managed it. I had learned to keep my workspace closed, to not talk about my progress around him, to treat his small cruelties like weather. Something that happened, not something aimed at me. I had been wrong before about what people were capable of. I was wrong again. I woke up Wednesday morning at 6, earlier than I needed to, the way you do before something important. I lay in bed for a few minutes, going through the drive to Chicago in my head. 2.5 hours. I needed to check in with the Institute's coordinator before noon on Wednesday, so they could log my arrival and assign me to preparation space for the next morning. I had every step mapped. I was fine. I got up, made coffee, and walked into the kitchen. The case was still by the front door where I'd left it. But the latch was open. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself I hadn't latched it properly the night before, that it had swung open on its own, that the foam was probably fine, and everything inside was fine, and I was being anxious, because of course I was being anxious. It was the day before the most important evaluation of my career. I crossed the room in 3 steps and lifted the lid. The erosion piece was in 4 sections. The top two tiers had separated from the base and were lying on their sides in the foam, the filaments shattered into small translucent fragments around them. The latticed cage was still standing, but 3 of the bars had snapped at the base and the whole structure had leaned inward. The orb was intact. I didn't understand why the orb was intact until I looked more carefully and saw that the 2 larger pieces had fallen toward each other, and the orb had been cushioned between them. I stood there with my hands on the edge of the case, and I did not move for probably 30 seconds. Caden's bedroom door was at the end of the hall. I walked to it and knocked once. He opened it in the slow, unhurried way of someone who had been awake for a while. I said, "Did you open my case?" He looked at me and then passed me toward the front door and said, "I was just looking at it." I said, "You were just looking at it." He said, "I didn't think it was a big deal. I was careful." I said carefully, "2 of the 3 pieces are broken." He shrugged. Not the shrug of someone who feels bad and doesn't know how to say so. The other kind. The kind that means, "This is your problem and I am not part of it." He said, "They're made of sugar. They break." I went to find my mother. She was 45 minutes away and I called her from the kitchen while Caden was still in his room. I told her what happened, trying to keep my voice level, and she listened and then said, "Abby, I'm sure he didn't mean to break anything. You know how he is with boundaries. Maybe you should have locked the case." I had not locked the case because it lived by my front door inside my own home. She said, "Don't let this derail you. You're so close. Just focus on Thursday." I said, "Mom, 2 of my pieces are destroyed." She said, "Can you fix them?" I said I didn't know. She said, "Then focus on what you can control." And then she asked if I was eating enough, because apparently that was a thing that needed to be addressed at that moment. I hung up and went back to the kitchen and sat down on the floor next to the case, which I know sounds dramatic, but the table was covered in my supplies, and there was nowhere else to go. I looked at the pieces. I assessed. The erosion piece's base and bottom tier were intact. The middle 2 tiers were separable from the debris. The filaments were gone, but the tier structures themselves hadn't cracked, just disconnected at the joins. The top tier was split down the center. The cage was salvageable if I could re-pull 3 bars and reattach them without disturbing the isomalt flower, which had survived intact somehow, which felt like either luck or a sign, and I was not usually a person who believed in signs, but I was having a specific kind of morning. I sat on the floor for 11 minutes. I know because I looked at the clock when I sat down and again when I got up. Then I got up. I didn't have time to rebuild from scratch. What I had time to do was decide what the damage meant and whether I could work with it. The erosion piece without its 2 upper tiers was a different piece. It was smaller, more compressed. The weathering effect actually read more powerfully on the remaining structure, because all the visual weight was concentrated. I could re-pull the filaments for just the 1 remaining tier and reattach them, and what I'd have was a piece that looked intentional rather than incomplete. The cage I could repair. It would take 4 hours and I would have to be very careful at the joints, but I had done it before on worse breaks. The orb was untouched. I worked from 8 in the morning until 9 at night with 2 short breaks for food I barely tasted. Caden left the house around noon and didn't come back until after dark. He walked through the kitchen without saying anything and went to his room. I let him. By 9:15 I had 2 repaired pieces and 1 untouched piece. The erosion sculpture was smaller than I'd designed it. The cage had 1 join that I wasn't fully satisfied with, but that was structurally sound. I repacked the case, this time with a combination lock I'd had in a drawer since college and had never used. I drove to Chicago alone the next morning. Arrived at the Harlow Institute at 9:40, checked in, set up in my assigned preparation space. At 10 o'clock, I carried my case into the evaluation room and placed my 3 pieces on the presentation table. There were 2 evaluators. One was a pastry chef I recognized from her work. She'd been a semi-finalist at the National Sugar Arts Championship 3 years in a row. The other was a man I didn't recognize, whose name placard said Dr. James Okafor. I had researched every person who might be in that room, because that was the kind of preparation I did. I did not recognize Dr. James Okafor, which meant either I'd missed something, or he was a late addition. The pastry chef walked the table slowly, looking at each piece from multiple angles. She picked up the orb and held it toward the light. She set it back down and looked at the erosion piece for a long time. Dr. Okafor was looking at my written philosophy statement. The pastry chef asked me to walk them through my process on the erosion piece. I did. I talked about the pull temperatures, the humidity control, the number of attempts it had taken to get the filaments right, the way I'd discovered that cooling the sugar in direct airflow versus ambient air changed the translucency. I talked about what the piece was supposed to represent. The way something can be worn down by forces outside its control and still hold a kind of structural integrity that wouldn't have been visible if it had stayed perfect. She asked about the scale. She said it looked like I might have originally conceived of it as a taller structure, given the proportions of the base. I said, it was 5 tiers in the original design. I made a decision to reduce it. She asked when I made that decision. I said, the morning before the evaluation. She looked at me differently after that. Not with sympathy, with something more like attention. She said, what made you decide to reduce it rather than start over? I said, starting over wasn't possible in the time I had. And when I looked at what was left, I realized the story I was trying to tell was actually more visible in the smaller version. Sometimes the limitation clarifies the intent. She wrote something on her notepad. Dr. Okafor looked up from my philosophy statement. He said, you referenced Eliza Hartwell in your statement. I said I did. He said, I was her graduate advisor at Northwestern. She sent me your statement last month. I did not know what to do with that information, so I just held very still and waited. He said, she described you as someone with genuine technical instinct and an unusual relationship with failure. She said you treat failed attempts as data rather than defeats. He paused. That piece tells the same story. Eliza Hartwell had been my instructor for 1 semester 3 years ago at a community college extension program in sugar arts. She had written my recommendation letter for the Harlow application. I had not known she had sent my philosophy statement to anyone else, or that she had any connection to anyone currently affiliated with the institute. The evaluation ran 61 minutes. It was scheduled for 35. When I walked out of the building and got to my car, I sat in the parking structure for a long time with the engine off. My hands were perfectly steady. The last time my hands had been that steady was the moment I'd decided to get up off my kitchen floor and go back to work. Something had happened in that room that I hadn't been prepared for. I had walked in carrying the weight of what Caden had done, and somewhere in the middle of explaining why I'd reduced a 5-tiered sculpture to 3 tiers the morning, before the most important evaluation of my life, that weight had turned into something else. The thing he'd broken had become the most honest thing on that table. The damage he'd meant to leave me with had made me say something true about my own work that I might never have said if everything had gone smoothly. I drove home in 3 hours instead of 2.5 because I stopped at a rest area and sat at a picnic table by myself in the October cold and ate a vending machine sandwich and watched the highway for a while. I wasn't sad. I wasn't triumphant. I was very, very quiet inside, in a way I hadn't been in a long time. 5 weeks later, I received my acceptance letter from the Harlow Institute. One of 8 candidates selected from over 240 applicants. Full residency. Full stipend. The partner placement I'd been working toward for 4 years. I read the email in my car in the parking lot of the bakery before my shift, and then I sat there for 10 minutes before I went inside. That evening, when I got home, Caden was on the couch. I put my bag down and stood in the doorway and said, I got in. He looked up from his phone. He said, to the chef thing? I said, yes. He said, cool, and looked back down. I didn't say anything else to him that night. I called my mother, who cried in a way that would have felt good to me 2 years ago. She said, I always knew you had it in you. I let a few seconds pass before I said, you told me to focus on what I could control. She went quiet. I didn't say anything more. Sometimes the silence does the work better than the words. My father called an hour later. He didn't know what the Harlow Institute was, but I could hear that he was proud, in the way that he was proud of things he didn't understand, which was actually a kind of pure and uncomplicated pride that I had learned to appreciate for what it was. Caden never mentioned the case, never acknowledged the broken pieces, never asked what I had done to fix them, never once gave any indication that he understood what he had tampered with, or what it had cost me the morning before the evaluation. He did not apologize. I stopped waiting for it sometime around the end of the first week after he moved out, which was 6 weeks after my acceptance, which was 2 weeks after I told him I needed my house back. He moved out with the same lack of ceremony he'd brought to everything else, loaded his things into a friend's truck on a Saturday morning while I was at work, and left a key on the kitchen counter. I found out 8 months later, through my mother, that Caden had applied for a manager position at the sporting goods store and hadn't gotten it. That he was still in the same job, still in the same situation, still telling himself the same story about why things weren't working out the way they were supposed to. I didn't feel satisfaction when I heard that. I felt something closer to tiredness, A very old, very specific tiredness that comes from loving someone who cannot get out of their own way and knowing that there is nothing you can do about it. I moved to Chicago for the residency that January. My apartment was 4 blocks from the Institute, on the third floor of a building with good light and a kitchen just big enough for my equipment. I still have the repaired cage piece. It sits on a shelf above my workbench, with the one join that I wasn't fully satisfied with facing the wall. The other 2 pieces I gave away, the orb to Eliza Hartwell as a thank you, the reduced erosion sculpture to the Institute after my residency ended. They put it in a display case in the hallway near the evaluation rooms. I've walked past it dozens of times since then. I don't look at it the way you might expect. I don't look at it and think about Caden, or my mother, or the morning I sat on my kitchen floor with the clock on the wall and 11 minutes of grief before I stood up. I look at it and think about pull temperature and humidity and the specific quality of sugar filaments, cooling in still air versus moving air, and the particular way that a broken thing can be truer than the whole version ever was. Some people will always resent you for wanting more than what they were able to want for themselves. They'll open cases they have no right to open and handle things they don't understand and walk away without looking back, because looking back would require them to see clearly. What they don't understand, what my brother has never understood, is that the damage they do is not the final word. The final word belongs to the person who gets up off the floor and goes back to work. I am a resident designer at one of the Harlow Institute's partner studios now. I have a waiting list that runs 14 months out. Last fall, I was a semi-finalist at the National Sugar Arts Championship, the same competition where Eliza Hartwell's evaluator had watched the best in the field compete, year after year, until she retired and joined the faculty of an institute that found people like me. If this story stayed with you, hit subscribe right now. Every week on this channel, we share stories about people who refuse to let someone else's smallness become their ceiling. What's coming next week? I promise you don't want to miss it.